Thank you all for having me. Is there anyone here who has not been to the Merchant's House Museum? All right, you over here on the I can't say enough about this place. I'm going to gas bag for 45 minutes about it, but I have to tell you, you know, there are a few, and I hate to use the word unique, but I will use the word unique. There are a few unique historical buildings in this city that should be on everyone's list, and for some reason this house gets missed from time to time by people. There are French people running through this, there are German people running through this house, but not always New Yorkers and not always Americans. But there is no more completely, for me, emblematic building of the Greek Revival period and subsequent periods than this building. And my theme, if there is a theme tonight, it's you know Positively 4th Street? Anybody old enough to know that song?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Pine Gardner, who's sitting in the back so that she can buzz out of here without anyone noticing, and I have been working together since 1990. And I think we both feel the same about this house. I am fearful about this building because we live in a city that seems to be taking a turn in which people who wish to, you know, development shouldn't be a bad term, but this building is threatened. I'm going to go through a number of sort of benign threats that have been taking place on this thing forever. But you know, we all know that this is what's happening in New York City. It seems to me that in 20 years it's going to be Hong Kong. I live in Brooklyn. There was just an article about all the high rises that are going up in Brooklyn. It's going to be an unrecognizable city. Well, maybe that's okay, but not at the expense of pieces of heritage. In my book, it's not valuable if all of our heritage gets destroyed. And so we live in an ever-changing city. We've got to face it. My talk is going to be about the Merchant's House. Again, to just sort of to beat the dead horse, you know, we lose buildings sometimes on an annual basis. You know, here's a nice postcard of a bunch of buildings on the Bowery. Have you been to the Bowery recently?
Yeah.
This is nearly unrecognizable. All of these buildings now are threatened. 4 of these buildings are for sale as a development lot. It's nearly criminal. Okay, so now I've depressed everyone. I want to sort of gas bag a little bit about the Merchant's House, how it came to be, and where we are. This man was the president when the Merchant's House was built, Andrew Jackson. The population of the 24 United States at that point was 12,866,000. That's like, I don't know, the Lower East Side. And just to give you a little flavor, I'm sorry, I love doing this kind of stuff, all the arcane. We were at war, but we were at war way out west with the Fox and Sax Indians. We were amazingly massacring people at that time. But only one war the entire time that Jackson was president, which is the time that the Merchant's House was built. Slavery had been abolished in 1827. There were people who still, in 1832, interestingly enough, there was slavery in the South. In the South, it cost $15 a year to finance the life of a slave on a farm. In the North, it cost $90 a year to have a farm worker working for you. So you can see where someone thought that there was a great advantage to having slaves. Already, Greece had abolished slavery before we did. England had abolished slavery before we did. Spain had abolished slavery before we did. So this is our economic climate. The Merchant's House was built in what was, at that point, in 1832, the far reaches of New York City, although it was becoming a relatively fashionable neighborhood. And things were going along. In 1820, the population of New York City was 123,000. In 1830, it was 203,000. It had nearly doubled in 10 years. Imagine, if you will, the population of New York City doubling now, the amount of building that would be going on. Talk about having your heritage trashed. There'd be nothing left. There'd be nothing left here. So, at that point, at the point when the Merchant's House was built, the population of Boston was 61,000. The population of the East Village today is 65,000. Crazy numbers, very, very interesting numbers. Okay. Much of the country was living in things like this. Wood was really in even many urban areas prior to the 1835 fire in New York City. Wood, lumber, was the predominant building material. There were 8 million acres of land being timbered in 1832. 8 million acres of land in this country. Most of it in the east was being done. We still hadn't hit the west yet and decimated that, but 8 million acres. So, New York City. Actually, this is kind of a cheating slide. Anyone know this building? 132 Charles Street? Fantastic building. It was constructed in wood. Unfortunately, when we restored this building for the owner a couple of years ago, the city, the Department of Buildings would not let us restore it in wood. So what you're looking at is cement board siding on this building now. But it's emblematic to me of the kind of buildings that were being constructed in the 1830s in New York City prior to the fire. Now, in our neighborhood, Bond Street, just south of East 4th Street, very fashionable. Just a little bit north was LaGrange Terrace, it's called Astor Row now. So this was an area that was very desirable. There are still some buildings from that era, you know, sadly in some cases misshapen. There still are a few survivors. This building, I believe, is for sale again for $10 million. Is that the asking price?
Where is it?
It's on Bond Street, just east of Lafayette. And so, here we come back to the Merchant's House. What was the genesis of Merchant's House? I'm not an architectural historian, where at the Rhode Island School of Design, architectural history was taught at 8 a.m. on Monday morning. I'll say nothing else. I know a little bit, I know enough. I know enough about Athenian Stewart, John Stewart, Stewart and Revett, two gentlemen from Great Britain who spent a lot of time in Athens and in Greece documenting, drawing the classical buildings. They published folios, and those folios were then used by master builders to construct classical revival buildings. Okay, so we have that flavor. This is the late 18th century. We move into the 19th century. We have this amazing event that takes place in 1821, the Greek War of Independence. The Greeks, Christians, fighting the Turks, the Muslims. There was a huge amount, a generation of ideology at work here, and the iconography then of classical Greece worked its way into the American psyche in classical revival furniture, in poetry, and so we find that iconography making its way into places like Bond Street, into places like Maine, into Nantucket. Pretty much, you can't go to a town on the East Coast where there's not some federal or classical revival, Greek revival building extant. Interestingly, at the same time, 1830, the Architect for Practical House Carpenter by Asher Benjamin, very important pattern book for master builders. We were just beginning to call them architects at that point. So we had master builders, Asher Benjamin. This is another, there were proliferation of pattern books that people could use to construct perfectly, wonderfully pristine buildings like this, buildings like the Merchant's House, using, again, all of the classical iconography. The Merchant's House itself, and Pi can correct me, I would say that I'm going to say two things later on. One is to recommend that you go to the, if you can't go to the Merchant's House yourself because it's too hot, too hazy, too humid, go to their website, because there's a great deal of information that I am not giving you about the family, about some of the other aspects of the building that you can find on their website. But in my studies, in my interest about the house, I find that what you see at the Merchant's House Museum is kind of a transition from that federal period architecture into the Greek revival. It's really a wonderful transition, so that we end up with some amazing, amazing details. So we have 1835, just a few years after the construction of the building. There was a fire in Lower Manhattan. The city then dictated that no more wooden roofs, and all row houses had to be built of brick masonry or stone masonry. Now, there were thousands of houses like the Merchant's House Museum at that point. Today, there are 130. That's all that's left. What do you think about that? Back to the story. 1825, we have the opening of the Erie Canal. Now, interestingly, not only was the population of New York doubling, the economy was doubling. We still weren't at the 1837 stock market crash. Oh, the crash had to do with speculative lending. Good thing we got over that, because that's never happened since. But we had this merchant class emerging, and we have the guy who was a young merchant at that point, now the old Merchant's House, making a lot of money, and that money was put into their houses. What other status did you have? Okay, so now I'm going to shift a little bit, and I hope you won't nap, but one of the things that's extremely compelling to me about buildings in New York City, at least the 19th century, 18th century buildings, is how they were constructed. You know, I am in a field that I occasionally consider is like getting paid to do playground. I get to look at bricks, I get to play with wood, I get to look at stone, I get to tell Pi what's wrong with her stone. I'm an extremely fortunate person. Well, sometimes I get paid, thank you. But the predominant materials for the Merchant's House were wood. Remember, 8 million acres of lumber, brick, hold please, brick, which is essentially baked clay, the accession, that's not an historical photo, the accession of this material, you know, first we have extraction of the materials, then we have transport to markets like New York City, and then we have additional conversion of the materials into what we make our buildings from. And you know, it's sort of telling when you start to realize how long it took. There's southern yellow pine on the floors of the merchant's house. How long it took a load of pine, probably by boat, to get to New York City. When you start to, I'm going to fill you with so many arcane, idiotic facts tonight. Think of the amount of labor, you know, that it took to just do something like make a brick. I'll get to some more arcane information in a minute. Okay, Erie Canal, completely worthless with regard to the Merchant's House Museum. Everything used in the Merchant's House Museum came from up and down the East Coast. It didn't come from the West. So that was no help at all. We had slate from Vermont. We had marble from Inwood, which is just up the Hudson River. Unfortunately, it's some of the worst marble in America, but we'll get to that later also. And we had lumber that was coming from the north, being rafted down the Hudson River. Those pieces, all the logs were tied together. They would raft them down in the springtime. Sometimes there would be a mill. There were a couple of mills just north of the city where then the logs would be turned into dimensional lumber, timbers, and then brought further down to the city. One of the interesting things that we discovered several years ago, at the end of the log, so that you could identify your lumber, your timber, there were brands that were embossed into the ends of logs. We had to do some repair work on the west party wall of the Merchant's House Museum several years ago because of some issues that I'll relate to you soon. And we took some of the bricks apart. We actually got to the end of a floor joist, and there was a brand. No one I know had ever seen one of those log brands before in New York City. Unfortunately, we had to photograph it and then cover it up because we couldn't pull the floor joist out. That would be so it's there, had never seen one before. So we have this is the kind of, well, a little pixelated, but this is the kind of situation we had in the spring on the Hudson. The term log jam isn't for nothing. Okay, imagine, out of context, of course, with the Merchant's House, but that was the size of trees that people were able to forest at that point. And of course, all of it was done by hand, This was the era of the skilled tradesperson. Imagine just, I'm sure there aren't too many people there who have made mortise and tenon joints, but when you consider the amount of work that it takes just to take a chisel, pound it into an 8 or 10 inch piece of timber, and then finish it off so that it's squared, it takes hours. It takes hours to do these things. So you start to think about the accumulation of time that it took to do things. The process of wood conversion was changed dramatically by the invention of this, the circular saw. Unfortunately, it came 10 years after the construction of the Merchant's House Museum in 1860. Again, just to if I can emphasize this, the amazing, amazing size of the trees that we were getting, and all of them ended up being usable by hand tools, only by hand tools. Of course, then, the hand of the craftsman can be seen in all of the details of the Merchant's House Museum. Just to beat this horse a little bit more, by the 1870s, we had these machines where these folks were now pulling levers and stepping on pedals. They were no longer actually involved in fashioning amazing pieces of wood. Industrialization of the woodworking industry, 1870s by 1880, it's all over. It's all over. Bricks. Nice little cubes, nice little elongated pieces of essentially cooked dirt. Everyone remembers that? Yes, thank you. I show that to my Columbia students and they got a look on their face like, you know, what this guy is doing. Okay, the exterior of the merchant's house and portions of the interior made from brick. This is one of the bricks that we found. This is from the Hudson River brick manufacturing. The Hudson River at one point had over 8,000 brick fabrication plants, facilities, I won't call them plants, in the 19th century.
Is that up by Croton Point?
Sorry?
By Croton Point?
All over the place. Yeah, Croton Point was one of them, Haverstraw, all up and down the Hudson River because there were great clay deposits and lots of wood to burn. The merchant's house came at a time when we were moving from what was essentially handmade bricks, hand-pressed into wooden molds, to what are called pressed bricks, which was an extrusion process. And you can see in this slide, this is the merchant's house, laid in Flemish bond. This is a house from the same era. This is a house from 1810. You can see the difference in the brick. First of all, because the brick is so uneven, because the surface vacillates, you have to have a wider mortar joint, okay, in order to bond those bricks together. Once you've established a perfectly fine plane, you need very, very little mortar to keep these things sticking together. Mortar. You didn't go to the lumber yard and buy a bag of Portland cement. What you did was gather limestone or gather shells, and I've done the shell thing, it's insane. You burned it for a long time until it turned to powder, and then you threw it in a pit with water, and you did what's called slaking. You slaked the lime. In many cases, you slaked the lime for a year. So there were constantly continuous processes of lime making all over the place. But imagine if you decided to build a house out in the suburbs, you went to a contractor and he said, okay, I can get to that in about a year because I've got to slake the lime first. Insane amount of labor.
How many shells would you need?
Sorry?
How many shells would you need?
How many shells do you need?
Would you need, yeah.
A gazillion.
Plus the year.
Yeah. A gazillion shells in 1 year. Okay. Here's the stone. This is our Gibbsian surround on the main door of the Merchant's House Museum of Inwood lime. I call it marble because you can polish it. The difference between limestone and marble, limestone that's more metamorphosed so that you can actually polish the surface. That's what marble is. Limestone generally won't take a polish. This will take a polish. This has been so beaten by the environment that it's lost all polish. This is possibly the worst limestone in America, but it was convenient. It was right up the Hudson River. It was right at the northern tip of Manhattan. There were quarries for Inwood marble up there. What happens is that in a sulfurous, I don't want to get too technical, but in a sulfurous atmosphere like New York when you're burning coal, the lime paste that holds the crystals together essentially melts. You've got acid raining down on this material that just wants to dissolve, and that's what's happened. Don't tell pie, but occasionally what I'll do is come along and actually rub my finger on some of this stone, and it's friable. It is disaggregating. One of the things that we have on our list of things to do within the next 15 years is actually do a consolidation effort on this stone. Otherwise, all the detail will be lost. It's already lost to a certain degree. Now, 19th century, this is where all that stuff was coming from. It was coming out of quarries in huge blocks. The mechanics of fabricating the stone hadn't changed since the Egyptians. The way that you split a piece of stone is the process is called feather and wedge. There's a little wedge. You first drill a hole by hand with an iron tip. Then you put an iron wedge into it, and you put what are called feathers on either side of that wedge. They're little wedge-shaped pieces, and you drive that wedge into the stone. You do it here, 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 here. You continually do that until you either go berserk or you split the stone. All done by hand. Then, of course, it was finished by hand. All hand tool. So, next time you go to the merchant's house, you haven't been there yet, but you're going to, aren't you? Take a look at the stone on that building and remember that it was all cut by hand. How was it shipped? This is the extent of railroads in the country at the time the merchant's house was built. So it came by horse down through Manhattan. There he is. Other materials, the lumber from the south came up by boat. The slates, hard to tell about the slates from Vermont on the roof. They could have come by boat, they could have come by horse, but they certainly didn't come by train. So we're talking about at least a week's worth of shipping time for those things. Again, the slate, these slates are not on the merchant's house. Okay, just so you know that. This is the worst slate in America. This is from Pennsylvania. You can see veins of carbon through this. This slate is from Vermont. This is what was used on the merchant's house. Excellent material. Excellent material. It'll last 200 years. The stuff will last 200 years. Typically, the problem with slate roofs is that the flashing, everyone know what flashing is? Anyone know what flashing is? Flashing is the material, if you have a wall like this and a roof like this, you have to somehow waterproof the joint between those two components. And you do that usually with sheet metal. Flashing is what deteriorates before the slates do. Copper has about a 75-year performance life. Okay, so on a building like the merchant's house, even if you started today, the slate will last longer than the flashing. But the minute the roof starts to leak, contractor comes along and says, "Oh, you got to replace your roof." So everything goes. When all you really have to do is replace the flashing. Anyway, here it is. They're getting this stuff out of the ground. They're splitting it by hand, shipping it off to New York City, where it goes onto the merchant's house. One more thing I want to talk about, windows. I love windows. Okay, they're windows to me are like furniture attached to the side of the house. There's fine woodworking in it. The joinery is incredibly delicate, and yet you're moving these things up and down. They're getting pounded by rain and snow all year long, and yet they have the delicacy. All the little joints are pinned. There are mortise and tenon joints where they fit together. It really is, it's like Duncan Fife stuck on the side of your house. Now, two things take place that change this to this. One, science. In the 19th century, people started understanding about performance and strength of wood. Before, when I'm talking about these craftspeople, you know, there were plenty of knucklehead craftsmen who did it this way because that's how my father taught me how to do it. I'm going to continue to do it this way. Science changed all that. Science made people understand, and I've got a little mutton selection that I want to show you, speaking of Greek revival muttons. People understood that you didn't necessarily need to have a muntin, and that's the piece that holds the glass in a window. It's called a muntin. It didn't have to be 2 inches thick. You could have a very slender muntin and still hold the same size piece of glass. That was all science, because people were then starting to study the strength of wood, the properties of wood. The other thing that windows were dependent upon was glass technology. Traditionally, this is called crown glass. And typically what you do with a piece of crown glass is you blow a huge bubble. A guy comes along, snips the end open, and you begin to spin the bubble. You spin it, and it flattens out. You then flatten it out on a bed of ash, then you anneal it in an oven, and then someone comes along and actually cuts the pieces of glass out of that disc. You know what's called crown glass, those bubbly things? Typically, that was, this little piece of instrument here is called a punty. He's got the blowpipe here. The punty is here, P-O-N-T-I-L, it's a French word. And the punty is attached to a large blob of glass. That's the worst piece of glass in the whole crown. So they were actually cheap. That's why you see those little bubble pieces on transoms and things like that, not necessarily in windows. Useless information. Nevertheless, what you need to know is glass technology changed from this, very traditional, the Romans were blowing glass like this, to what's called cylinder glass, where they would just actually blow a bubble, stand above the floor, blow the bubble down, so they ended up getting a huge cylinder of glass, pop that off the pipe, someone would come and split that and fold it open on a table. Perfect. Much easier, much faster. By the 1840s, the French had invented float glass, but we're not there yet. We're still in this very traditional glass-making situation. Now, to go back to the muttons again. This is the kind of mutton that we see on the merchant's house. It's only about 5/8 of an inch wide. This is what we see in early Dutch houses, because it was not that understanding that you could actually get away with this rather than have a monster like that on your windows. And so we go from very small pieces of glass in large overbearing wood structures to these beautiful, sensuous, sinuous muntins like we have here at the merchant's house. And again, the pattern books, we have all the pattern books showing us not only the stylistic details, but the actual craftsmanship details. This is from Asher Benjamin, actually, and it shows construction of a door. And if you look at the doors at the merchant's house, you'll see that all of the joinery is exactly like this. The windows are the same. By the end of the 1830s and into the 1840s, we actually had catalogs where craftspeople, finished carpenters, could buy their tools. And again, remember, the population of New York City is doubling, so they needed more carpenters, they needed more craftspeople. That confluence all comes together. We've got cast iron, we've got wood, we've got brick, we've got plaster. Same plaster and lime mortar, essentially the same makeup originally. It's burning lime paste, making lime paste. by the time we start to see more railroads, this is a later phase of the development of the interior of the merchant's house, where we start to see more exotic materials coming in. This is not an original firefront. We've got stone coming in now from Europe. We've got stone coming from other places in the US. So we've built our house. It's 138 years old now, Pi? Okay.
That was a test, I know.
83.
Since 1832.
183.
Since 1832, we have had 8,454 inches of rain in New York City, or 704 feet of water pounding down on the top of that building. That's 22 tons per square foot of water over its lifetime. Sorry, I love this. Since 1832, we've had an average of 381 feet of snow sitting on the roof of the merchant's house, for a total weight of 5,715 pounds. I had fun putting this stuff together. Now, sometimes, those are some of the things that are acting on the house. Here's Versailles, poor Versailles. If you've ever been there, if you don't get there at 6 o'clock in the morning, you're out of it. You're done. Well, at the merchant's house, I've been told that they have 15,000 visitors per year. That's 30,000 feet scuffling and kicking and stomping the floors of the Merchant's House Museum. How many more in a day than the family experienced in a year when they were living there? Okay, so that's 2,250,000 pounds, or 1,125 tons of visitor meat stomping through that house in a year. Okay? No wonder Pi doesn't let them sit on the furniture. Now, other things that have been acting on the house. When it was constructed, there were houses on either side. And that's great, because then we have our adjacent buildings helping to support us. Once you take those buildings away, there are other forces that start to act upon the house, lateral forces, wind forces. Oh, and something I really didn't want to make a big deal of, but if you can imagine a day like today, where it starts off at 75 degrees in the morning, goes up to 90, then it'll go back to 75 degrees tonight. That's a lot of temperature change on these materials. And if you remember from science, when materials get warm, they expand. When they cool, they condense. So every day, that house is getting bigger and getting smaller for 183 years. It's an enormous amount of change. Okay, so we've got our two friends on either side, they're gone now. They're gone. Not only are there different things that happen because of the lateral loads, once they go, the bricks on the party walls, which tend to be not fired as high as the bricks on the facade, which means they're a little bit more absorbent, start to suck up water. And so we start to see problems with plaster on the inside of those walls. And this has been a chronic issue at the Merchant's House ever since they started knocking these buildings down. On the west facade, where they took the building down to the one-story garage level, the amount of moisture that entered into it's not really a crawl space. The original framing was constructed on the earth, but water got down into that wall and started to rot the framing away in what was the family's original dining room. I'm going to just go by this quickly, but this, Pi and I always sort of talk about what's next. You know, I met Pi in 1990 we did what's called an historic structure report for this house, which is essentially putting together a history of the house and an assessment of the conditions. And unlike most clients who I have, who pay, that report costs $90,000. That's why I'm able to wear Orbis shirts. Pi, unlike most clients, didn't put that thing on a shelf and say, thank you, we'll get around to some of these things. She said, what's next? What's the most important thing? And so that lady back there, I know you're trying to hide, is absolutely
Finished yet, Michael?
the best caretaker one could imagine. Pays on a 90-day schedule, but she's the best caretaker this house could even conceive of having. This is a list of some of the things that have happened at that house. I absolutely refuse to read this to you the way some people do, but I'm going to zip by just so you have an idea of the magnitude. And aside from the major stuff, there's always the other stuff. The toilet's leaking, the lights went out here, a rat got into the something or other. There is always something to do at that house. Now, without casting any aspersions, what I'd like to do is go through a few things that happened at the house that were attempts at remediation of existing conditions that didn't necessarily turn out right. One of the things that happened at the house in the 1980s was that there was this miracle material called ThoroSeal that everyone thought, well, if I'm, rather than repoint my lime mortar bricks, because lime also disaggregates when it has sulfurous rain hitting it, it kind of dissolves. Rather than repoint the bricks, I'm just going to cover it with this cementitious material called ThoroSeal. ThoroSeal is the kiss of death for a building. It's completely moisture impervious, which means that when you're breathing and that air comes out of you that's moist in the wintertime and all the other things that are happening in a house like this, it gets entrapped in the walls. On the west wall, on the west party wall, the entire wall had been covered with ThoroSeal. Okay. Perfect idea to not have to maintain that wall. However, once water started getting into joints in the coping stones at the parapets, it had no place to go but in. And water wants to seek a level of equilibrium. And so what it does, it goes toward a dry area. Couldn't go out because the ThoroSeal was there, but it went in. When I first went to the merchant's house and met Pi, the top floor walls looked like marshmallow fluff. What happens is the lime in that mortar goes into solution again, and when it hits the surface, that dry surface, it dries out again, recrystallizes, and you get what's called efflorescence or bloom, this fuzzy looking white stuff that's just bizarre. It's like white cotton candy, and it covered the walls on the inside of this building and was destroying the plaster. So what we had to do was get that ThoroSeal off. We couldn't find anything that would work. We tried abrasive blasting with all different kinds of materials, walnut shells. We didn't use sand because that's absolutely forbidden in my business. But nothing would work. So what we ended up doing was pulling every brick off this building. And you could do it by hand. You didn't really have to hit these things. You break the ThoroSeal seal, and you could pull the bricks out by hand. What we did was pull them out, turn them around, reset them in a softer mortar so that the wall, I hate to use the word breathe, but that's what you understand. What that allowed this wall to do then is that if any water got in the top, and we repaired the top at the same time, if any water got in, it had an escape route out of the building rather than being forced to go into it.
Did any of the bricks disintegrate?
I'm sorry?
Did any of the bricks disintegrate?
Not really, not really.
So you were able to
Because
use
it was,
every brick?
that's actually a good point, because Portland cement mortar with an 18th century brick would have destroyed the bricks. It's much harder, it doesn't expand and contract at the same rate, and the bricks lose out.
So what did you do?
But it hadn't been repointed, we repointed with a softer lime mortar.
Oh, we did.
Yeah. Okay, waterproofing. The basement, the cellar underwent a waterproofing program just before we came on the scene, I believe. And very admirable process. Keep the moisture out of the cellar. The problem is that, and this was really a killer, you can see that the waterproofing material was attached with one strip of aluminum at the top. That's reasonable. But if you understand galvanic reactions between metals, you realize that aluminum next to iron is going to cause the iron to essentially lose ions, and the iron is going to corrode. And so what happened is that little strip up there that was holding the waterproofing membrane against that wall let go. That waterproofing membrane fell down and started acting as a funnel, funneling surface water into the building. At the same time, the interior of the cellar, which was constructed of rough stone, had been repointed with Portland cement mortar, madam, to your point, completely moisture impervious. So moisture getting into this wall had no place to go, couldn't come in, so it went up. And we got a situation in that building that was just unbelievable. We had termites, you know, perfect. It was like a little Plato's retreat for termites. You know, it was 80 degrees in the summertime, 55 degrees in the wintertime, and moist. They were having a ball in there. Okay, still haven't been able to get rid of them all. Then came the tunnel next door. You know, everybody needs water. They're building the water tunnel next door. Wonderful. Here it is. They start to dig this tunnel through next to the Merchants House Museum, following all the city guidelines. Yeah, okay. So I get the frantic call from Pi, the house is falling down. You know, she doesn't say that with much frequency, but in fact, the house was falling down. They were blasting below the ground. They didn't have monitors. They didn't have they didn't put seismic monitors in the building until after Pi complained. I mean, and you know, threatened to kill a few people, I think. But in the meantime, we ended up calling our structural engineer, who came down and said, "You have to do this immediately," because what was happening was the plaster on that wall was completely separating from the brick substrate on the party wall. So here we have a city department building this thing, caring not one iota about what was going on this incredibly important historic building. Incidentally, at the same time, they managed to knock the wall down that was in the back of the Merchants House Museum, knock the garden wall down, which we had to have it reconstructed, and instead of reconstructing it the way it was, they just put up a new wall. Boom. Minor things happened. The Parks Department decided that they were going to give the Merchants House Museum some new bluestone flags out front. Perfect, nice job. Guy comes with a truck, bashes it into one of the urns, and damages the base. Sorry. Then we get a little leak. This is much more recent. We got a little leak up here, just outside the recently restored maid's room in the top floor of the building. Okay, Pi she makes the calls, gets everything in motion. The city sends out a contractor. The contractor does about 15 minutes of work, says what needs to be done, goes away, parts disappears. So, the sandbags holding the tarp down, okay, this has been there longer than anything was in New Orleans after Katrina, all right? The sandbags holding this thing down on the other side of the parapet are so old that they disintegrate. The sand pours down into the gutter and blocks the scupper in the gutter. So this gutter now, occasionally I go up, I kick some sand out of it, the water pours down the gutter, but until there's an actual fix, this is going to keep happening. Okay, I'm wrapping up now, I promise. This is happening right across the street from the Merchants House Museum. NYU. All I have to do is say NYU. NYU. It's true. And I would say one thing, you know, you young ladies will know, at the Landmarks Commission, we are frequently dealing with, more frequently than I would like to actually imagine. You'd be shocked to know the number of people who purchase modest row houses and want to turn them into Las Vegas pleasure palaces. One of the things that is the first thing they do is they want to put a 3-story addition on the roof, go back 20 feet on the back of the thing, and now we've got people who want to go into the ground. Okay. I had a client on West 18th Street. They built a condo next to her house. They should have bought her house from her because they could have bought her house for $3 million. Her building started to collapse into the excavation that was being done next door, and it fell fully 8 inches down on one side. The crack went through her building, all the way through her garden, and through the middle of a carriage house at the other end of the backyard. It cost them $7 million to repair it. The house, of course, you can't jack up a house like that. You have to essentially repair it in place. It cost the owner of the condo $7 million to repair it. Could have bought her house for free. I mean, no matter what you do to try to prevent damage to an historic building, remember the house has been there for 183 years, 2 tons of rain, 150,000 people. No matter what you do, there is going to be damage to the house. Okay? I try to keep a positive spin when I'm thinking about the Merchants House, but that's it. This is happening across the street. I can't even talk about this, but here's where they want to insert a 9-story building. Okay? Now, in my dreams, when I'm making myself fall asleep at night, all I think about is the house on 18th Street when I think about them putting a building in next to the Merchants House here. I don't care. No matter what they do, there's going to be some damage to the Merchants House. Now, when that damage occurred from building the tunnel, they had to close the house down 6 months, 7 months?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows? And the thing is, once the damage occurs, yeah, you can repair the damage, but then you don't have historic material anymore, where you have historic material that's been compromised. But with her in charge,
Killing me, Michael. You're practicing.
We're heading off into the unknown.
Stratosphere.
Okay, armed with our arsenal of things. Okay, this is called a crack monitor. I've installed these things all over the Merchants House. I've installed little crack monitors all over the interior of the house. The good part about that is that we'll know if the existing cracks on the house are getting worse. The bad part will be that once it happens, what on earth are we supposed to do? We're in trouble. And so this exists now. And I'm going to be watching this. I've been watching it as they're doing the NYU work across the street. My job now is to go to the house from time to time and monitor all those, we call them telltales, those plastic units. Everybody know how these work? They're really kind of fascinating. Okay, we got a little crack. You've got two pieces. One is this solid piece that has a grid and size on it. The other is a transparent piece that has a grid on it. You attach them to the building with hopefully a reversible adhesive of some kind, and you photograph it. So you know where the top grid and the lower grid are in relation to one another. You periodically come and you check it, and by seeing where the grids are in relation to one another, you can see where that crack's going, whether it's getting worse or even getting worse and getting better. It could be a seasonal thing. So we have that arsenal in place. Now, I'm just about to finish. I want to recommend to you, anybody who hasn't been to this house, you have to go, or you're going to be on my list. The book that Mary Knapp wrote about the family, which is it's already been published and they sell at the house, is a magnificent book about 19th century living in a house like the merchant's house. She's just about to finish a book talking about a lot of the things that I've been talking about, actually the history of the construction, the morphology of this building over time, and it's going to be fascinating. We've been able to see some of the drafts of this, and it's really magnificent. I'm going to leave you with a quote that was, I'm not going to tell you the author of the quote, but when I heard this thing, I just thought, yeah, this is a basic truism.
About women also.